Fergus Hodgson, and I am working on an Econ Americas podcast this month. That means we're focused on financial sovereignty. As many of you know, my own book published last year was Financial Sovereignty for Canadians, and I'm moving the Econ Americas content more in that direction. And one of the chapters in that book, in the epilogue, was a call for Alberta independence. Growing up, I never knew about this. My mother was from Alberta, and a lot of my family still live in Calgary and the surrounding area. I didn't know about the Alberta sovereignty movement, but I learned about it through the gentleman we're going to speak with today, Michael Wagner and Corey Morgan, and many other people. Barry Cooper is a great intellectual in this field. And so I wrote one chapter on this in the epilogue because basically I was saying, well, how do we escape Canada? And I say, Wexit is the path forward. That was my last chapter of the book. So we've got Michael Wagner, and this is incredible timing because it seems like everyone is in a fluster right now. There's a lot of in play in Canada. Now, so Michael Wagner, he has a PhD in political science from the University of Alberta in Edmonton. He is based in Edmonton, and he is an author of many books. His latest, which we will discuss today, is Time to Leave. Canada Cannot Be Fixed. I was really fortunate to meet him at Capitalism and Morality in Calgary midway last year. And also, he is a prolific columnist with the Western Standard, another great publication promoting the Alberta and just prairie spirit. Tell me, is there a lack of intellectual understanding of the issues?
Yes, I would say so. Well, actually, as far as I know, in recent years, there's only been four books. Like back in the 70s and 80s, there was like one book done in the 70s and one in the early 80s on these topics, and really nothing was done for several decades. And much of the important part of the independence movement emerged in the early 1980s. So there was no books that actually dealt with that in particular. So in 2009, I wrote the first history of the Alberta independence movement, like a history of the movement itself. In 2021, I wrote No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta, which is
Yes.
that's my case for Alberta independence. So it's different from the other one in terms of presenting the case. And then I thought that would be my final book on the independence issue. But what I found was that people who would read No Other Option would say, yeah, it'd be good if Alberta became independent, but before we do that, we need to try and fix Canada first. And that really frustrated me because Albertans have been trying to fix Canada for several decades. And it seemed to me many people had forgotten what we've done in the past to try and make things better in Canada. So the Time to Leave is specifically arguing that we have tried very hard, at least since the early 1980s, for Alberta to get its voice within Canada, and that everything that we've tried has failed, not because the people weren't trying hard enough or doing a good job, but because the political power in Canada is concentrated in central Canada, which is Ontario and Quebec, and they're not interested in what we have to say. They're not interested in our grievances with the central government because they already have the power. They can completely ignore us and it makes no impact. And so that's what they have done. Like we've tried major efforts of reforming Canada through Senate reform. And in the 1990s, we had a major federal political party called the Reform Party, where we sent our MPs to Ottawa. Specifically, their slogan was "The West wants in."
Yeah.
Our MPs were there to give us a voice in the national government so that they would hear what we have to say and make the changes necessary. And we were ignored again. So those are the two of the major efforts we've done, beginning in the 1980s with the Senate reform, and that carried over.
And I just want to add to that point that, yeah, so Preston Manning, Stock Day, and then Stephen Harper all were staunch pro-Alberta politicians who had supposed sway, and Stephen Harper even became prime minister. And he was literally one of the authors of, there was, what was it, some sort of, what was the statement back around the year 2000, the call, the firewall letter. And so if even Stephen Harper, one of the authors of the firewall letter, can basically achieve zero for Alberta, who can? And whether you like him or not, he's an intelligent man, a politically shrewd man. He did become prime minister and stayed there for, what is it, 6 years or a decent period of time. So he was reelected, which is not an easy thing to do as an Alberta conservative. You're not going to get a better prospect than that. So okay, and that's why. So I'll tell people. So this book, I've read this one. right? And then also I do recommend always Corey Morgan's The Sovereigntist Handbook. And of course, if people want to read mine, The Financial Sovereignty for Canadians, that maybe gives more of a practical guide to finding your sovereignty, and it just leans into the political element of Alberta sovereignty. Now, to be frank, I wonder why Alberta there's not a stronger push for this. Now, to be fair to Albertans, probably half of the United Conservative Party members and supporters would actually vote for independence right now. Yeah. So it's not a fringe view at all. It would be probably even stronger than the sentiment in Texas, right? Where the Republican Party of Texas has about half, maybe a slight majority, who support independence for Texas as a separate nation, right? So let's just back up a little bit and discuss what is going on with Canada, because Canada really has fallen behind the United States and is an extremely fragmented country. Is there anything other than status quo bias keeping Canada together? Why are these provinces even together? I mean, it seems very confusing to me. Is it just an accident of history?
If you look at it historically, I mean, there was kind of a logic to how it came together, in the 1800s with, the British colonies on the East Coast, and then they federated together and they wanted a continental country, and they were able to take what was called Rupert's Land from Britain, to stretch across the continent. And they had actually a pretty good plan for developing the West and to have a united country by putting a railway across there. So like in the initial stages, it made sense. And there was a strong patriotism in those early days, right? And so I think it would be a much more united country. Well, I guess it'd be more united country if before Pierre Trudeau came along. Like, I put a lot of emphasis on Pierre Trudeau because even though the West was discontented within Canada, for its first 100 years or so of being a part of Canada, there was no independence movement until Pierre Trudeau became prime minister in the late 1990s.
Late 70s.
Yeah, 1969, he became prime minister, and it was shortly after that the independence movement began, because despite the West's grievances within Canada at that time, they could all be worked out within Canada's federal system. So actually, Canada has a federal government, so the provinces have jurisdictions in certain areas, and the federal government has jurisdiction in international affairs, military, and things like that. And that system, in theory, works, and it did work until Pierre Trudeau came along, but he had a much more centralized version of Canada in his mind. He wanted a more control from Ottawa, more from the federal government, and it's as he kind of pushed that agenda that the West became more concerned about the federal government and wanting more autonomy for itself. So I put a lot of that on Pierre Trudeau himself for the vision that he had for Canada having more control as a federal state. And of course, he manifested that specifically against Alberta when the price of oil went up in 1973 as a result of the war in the Middle East. He, instituted an export tax on oil, on Alberta's oil, which was the first time in Canadian history that was done, so that the federal government would be taking much of the revenue that Alberta deserved. And he also imposed a much lower price on oil in Canada, much lower than the world price. So Alberta lost out. Whether we sold our oil within Canada or we exported it, we were losing money to the federal government. And that's kind of why Albertans first became quite angry with the federal government, and this movement really began to organize. I think if it wasn't for Pierre Trudeau's vision, if we had a decentralized emphasis in the federal government, I think the country would be more unified. Now, the one exception I'd make to that is Quebec, because Quebec has always had different grievances. Like Quebec, of course, was founded by France, and so they have French language and culture there, which is different from English Canada. They've always had concerns, with being in a majority English-speaking country, and so that aspect of division within Canada is kind of rooted in culture, which is different from the economic problems we have with federal government out here. So. But so in a sense that it was kind of difficult to maintain, a French speaking province within an English speaking country. And so there would always be divisions along those lines. But nevertheless, we were able to maintain a lot of unity until the 1960s. And I guess the Quebec nationalist movement began then, and that's actually what got Pierre Trudeau in power. And, kind of ironically, even though Quebec wanted more independence from Canada, Trudeau got involved to make Canada more centralized in the federal government.
The 2022 trucker convoy showed many Canadians had reached their limits. The convoy's participants encountered persecution from Ottawa and wondered what to do next. Financial Sovereignty for Canadians assists those looking to take direct action, and it outlines practical strategies. These include wealth protection with precious metals, the swiftest path to the United States, expatriation options in the Americas, censorship-resistant cryptocurrencies, and even the case for provincial independence from Ottawa. This book is a gateway to reclaiming your sovereignty, to being an economic driver and not a passenger. Buy it on Amazon.ca or click the link below. Michael, this is the wonderful thing. Michael has an incredibly rich understanding of the history, which is wonderful. And as you said, Canada, the provinces of Canada could coexist if there were profound or substantive decentralization, and there is not, unfortunately. And that is, and as you note, and so both Quebec and, you said, was it Rupert's Land? What was the original area title that became?
The prairies was called Rupert's Land. It was a Hudson's Bay territory. Hudson's Bay Company had this territory for fur trading, and it was Rupert's Land. It was, purchased by Canada about 1869.
Yes, and neither region or what became provinces, Quebec or the Alberta, voluntarily entered Canada, right? So there's almost an original sin there that it wasn't really a voluntary marriage. It was just, you're in, be quiet about it.
So when Rupert's Land was purchased, there was people living out here when it was purchased, and they were not asked if they wanted to be part of Canada, like you're saying. And so in 1870, we had what was called the First Riel Rebellion, where a settlement of mostly Métis people, which is mixed blood people of Aboriginal Canadians and white traders, and what's now Manitoba, they actually rose up in arms and refused the Canadian government, saying, we didn't, like, the governor came out there and said, I'm now your governor. And they said, no, you're not. And to make a long story short, after some negotiations, they formed the province of Manitoba so that they could actually have, their own government for that area where they did govern themselves within Canada.
Yeah, and because Canada does have, yes, you might say it has the Anglo-Celtic or British history, but there's a lot more complexity there to the country. And so long as it is decentralized or there's some local autonomy, that's not really a problem. You can have some, but like you said, for many reasons, that has broken down over the last 50 years. Uh, there is not even free trade between the provinces. That has caused conflict. It's, the Quebecers don't seem to want it. It's all these alcohol restrictions. It gets very complicated. But the point is that it seems like Ottawa has grown too strong. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms did not fit the purpose and has not been effective at protecting any rights or freedoms, it seems. And it really was just a vehicle for centralization. And you note there's a lot of great material in this book. So it's easy reading. It's just over 100 pages, quick to the point. And you note that fundamentally, Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms has no right to property. Isn't that scary? Insane.
That's a really important point because it was deliberately left out. Like, they deliberately left out property rights. It was in the initial proposal, and the Socialist Party in Canada, the NDP, demanded that it be taken out to, if the government wanted their support for the Charter of Rights. And so Pierre Trudeau, who was the prime minister at the time, gladly took out the property rights. And that's been very harmful, I believe, for Canada, because, in historic English speaking tradition, from John Locke's terms, we protect life, liberty, and property. Like, that's the historic liberal in the broad sense protections. And so that's to protect people from the government. So when you remove one of those protections, you're actually increasing the power of the state over the individual. So that was a deliberate move, to increase the power of the Canadian government by removing property rights from the citizens.
Okay, like I said, I'm on board with this. I just think it makes sense. And the usual arguments against Alberta independence really are juvenile, such as, oh, we don't have water access or ocean access. There are something like 44 countries in the world that are landlocked, including Switzerland, one of the most refined or successful countries on the planet. And so it's a bit silly. And also, of course, during the process of departure, there could be negotiations to address more access, if we want to have that. And then also people will say Alberta rests on an energy economy. And I'm going, well, you've stolen it for 50 years, the wealth that could have been reinvested. But of course, you and I know that really what makes a country successful is the people, their values, and work ethic and the like, their productivity. And Alberta has that in spades. So there's really no problem there. Further, Alberta already has around 4 or 5 million people, so it's a similar size population to New Zealand, where I grew up. To me, it's a no-brainer. So the real problem is that I actually recently released a video on my running channel about low testosterone. I feel like there's the lack of vigor in the Albertan people, all right, and that some no. So let's just use one example just to get this point across. Right now, Canada has this disastrous Canada pension plan, this Ponzi scheme, much like the US Social Security scheme, where they have all this fancy language and they put up these pretty reports and pretend that Canada has this fabulous pension program. It just so happens that they've increased the tax, I don't know, half a dozen times since it was introduced originally. And so people are paying a lot more and getting much less in return, or a much lower return on their money. And there's about more than $1 trillion worth of unfunded liability, and that's generous or conservative in calculation. I would estimate it much higher than that, but that's the official estimate. So why Alberta doesn't have its own pension system and opt out of this makes no sense to me. The Fraser Institute, a very rigorous and careful organization, estimated that Alberta could cut its Social Security taxes or Canada Pension Plan taxes by 40%. And yet we're here wrangling about it. And I just think, why is this not happening? This seems like a textbook case of the status quo bias, right? Where we're just stuck and we're afraid to do anything differently. Now, I guess my question then is, how can you overcome the status quo bias that of just assumption that Alberta is a part of Canada and not a separate or distinct nation, when really all economic and cultural logic suggests that Alberta should be a separate nation, but there just seems to be a stranglehold on, let's say, the media, the academic community, whatever it may be, standing in the way of this. What do you want to see happen to actually bring about an independent Alberta?
Like, one of the things, this isn't a big factor, but it is a factor, in that many people don't understand the history of how Alberta has been abused within Canada, for about 50 years or more. Like, when I go speaking and talk about these things, even people that are here have forgotten a lot of the things that happened in the 1970s and 80s that were done against us. So when I talk about these things, people go, "Oh, yeah, I remember that." And then there's younger people who, there's a lot of guys now in the 30s who are interested in some of these things, and they weren't around for it, so they don't actually remember what we went through. And so I think when I'm able to present, or when somebody's able to present the actual historical case, I think we win converts that way, when they understand what's been going on. But that's not the really big thing. The really big thing in the independence movement is that it comes in waves. And this is something that Preston Manning talked about, because he studied populist movements in Alberta, or on the prairies in general. There'll be some kind of political incident or situation that will lead to a rise in anger among the population, and suddenly there'll be support for Alberta independence. Like, that's how it started, in the late 70s and early 80s. Because Pure was attacking us, we get that big wave of support, which looks like it might actually be able to take us somewhere. But then, once the big bad guy, the politician, resigns, who's been hurting Alberta, the support goes down, and people are, revert to the status quo situation of before, until the next big thing happens. And then, after Pierre Trudeau, the next big thing was in 1986. Brian Mulroney, you're probably familiar. There was a big issue in Canada. The CF-18 fighter jet contract, which was a major government contract, had to be awarded, to a Canadian city, and the city that won that by the government's criteria, Winnipeg,
Oh
was
yeah.
denied the contract, and it was given to Montreal. Now, that was a huge thing, and that led to the creation of the Reform Party, like a wave of support. And that's specifically what Preston Manning was waiting for, that wave. He was waiting for the wave of support for a populist movement where he could build a political party. And that party lasted, for well over 10 years, and it was very successful. But we need a kind of a wave of support like that from something. And so we had that, actually. I think you mentioned the term Wexit. The Wexit movement started in 2019 because many Albertans thought we would get a new government with the federal election in October of 2019. And instead of even though the Conservatives won the popular vote, the Liberals were able to maintain a minority government. And so that led to a big wave of support for independence at that time. And so we were having big meetings in late 2019 with the Wexit movement. And of course, those meetings petered off. Shortly thereafter, we had the COVID thing came in, and so we couldn't have meetings, and there probably would have been other factors as well, but it's always some kind of an incident, whether it's a new government policy or an election, that makes people in Alberta angry, and you get a boost of support. But that support, I guess it's because it's largely emotionally based, it fades off over time after the major concern dissipates. And so people in the movement here, we talk about how we got to be ready for the next wave, because that seems to be how it happens. Like, I think over time, in fact, I think from polling data, we can show over time, like over decades, there is increasing support for Alberta independence. Like in the 1970s, when they would do polling on this issue, they would only find single digit support, like 4 or 5 or 6% support. And since 1980, it's been double digit support, maybe initially in the 15 to 17% range, but more in recent decades, it's been more in the 25% range. And then actually there was a poll in December, just this past December, where Albertans were asked if their province would be better off outside of Canada, and 38% said yes. So there's kind of a general trending, like that wasn't people committed to independence, but it was people saying Alberta would be better as an independent country. So there is kind of a general trend over time of support for independence. Like it was a fringe radical idea in the 70s, and now it's not as much of a fringe idea. People talk about it more and are more sympathetic to it. So it's taking a very long period of time, but there is, I think, a gradual support growing over time, and yet we still are going to need some kind of incident that will provoke a wave to get us over the top.
Yes, and so let's just back up, clarify what you said there. Fundamentally, there is an illiteracy in Alberta and Canada more broadly about the history of mistreatment of Alberta. It's the very opposite of Quebec, where Quebec gets showered with all these payments and extra representation in the parliament. It's insane. Read Corey's book for information on this. I could not believe it that Quebec just gets extra seats just because. Just because. Yeah. So when I read that, I thought, what? How does this happen? How is there not a riot? Okay. And some Canadians I speak with don't even know that equalization exists. What? What? It is more than 1,000 Canadian dollars per capita in Quebec is just taken from other provinces explicitly. And it's something like 3,000 in Nova Scotia. This is embarrassing. So Canada is a country that is is an incredibly redistributive system away from Alberta. But one of my so I agree with you that if Albertans understood the history of how they've been stolen from since the 70s, and how that not only was that explicit in the energy sector, it became an explicit program called equalization, right? And this is just an enormous magnitude over the years. But I'm not sure how much attention you've paid to the Brexit experience or episode, leaving the European Union. There's a book, and its name escapes me right now, on this, a lengthy book discussing what happened. And one of the key insights to me was that the Leave campaign was motivated by the Union Jack, the flag, pride. I hate to say this, but people don't always understand the economics, the numbers, but they understand the flag. Who in Britain gets excited about the EU flag? Forget it, right? To me, this is the real challenge, how to build this pride like they have in Texas, that we're Albertans, and that Albertans are tough, they are distinct, they're their own people. Is that not the real crux of the issue?
I think you're really touching on something there, but this reminded me of something that's quite ironic. Like Albertans in general, the people who are supportive of the independence movement are what we'd call small C conservative people generally.
Absolutely.
The small C conservative people here are among the most patriotic Canadians. And this is the irony,
Oh
because
dear.
the people who often support the independence movement were like very patriotic Canadians, and they'd been so offended by what's happened. And I spoke at an independence meeting in 2022 where they opened the meeting singing "O Canada." Like, I'm not joking. they sang "Oh Canada" at the beginning because like I say, these people are very patriotic. They're the least likely people, to actually want a movement in one respect, but they get so offended by what the federal government's doing, they feel betrayed. It's like they feel betrayed by their own government, literally. You know what I mean? And so that's one of the so what you're touching on there is one of the biggest obstacles, I think, because there is a sense of Alberta identity, but for many people it doesn't supersede the feeling that they have towards Canada. It's like in the United States, a small C conservative in the United States is probably the most patriotic American, right? And a small C conservative here is the most patriotic Canadian, and just as a generalization. But yeah, these are the same people who have been patriotic Canadians are the ones who feel offended and are more able to support, are more likely to support Alberta independence. But then, like once the provocative event from the federal government fades away, they kind of revert, like you say, status quo. They revert to their
Bias.
status quo, identity, a status quo bias. Yeah. So that definitely, we definitely need to build more Alberta identity. And I had a chapter on that in No Other Option because I was trying to hope to contribute towards that people would realize that our history is somewhat different from the rest of Canada. We are different in many respects from the rest of Canada.
Yeah, well, I don't see Alberta independence as anti-Canadian. I see it as anti-Ottawa. And you have to understand the distinction there because, in many ways, like you say, the Alberta independence supporters, they're proud of Canada's history, of the frontier pioneer people. I mean, why not? Of course, it's great. And they don't, maybe they don't seem to realize that Canada simply is not represented by Ottawa. Ottawa is almost like an alien class of people at this point. It's a little bit like here in the United States, where Washington, D.C., we have, in my view, an imperial or anti-American city and cluster of people. It doesn't really belong in the United States. It's an alien part of the country, and they don't relate to the rest of the country. And they have a kind of arrogance, to be frank, and look down upon the rest of the country. So, in many ways, it's almost like what is the term used to describe the American Revolution, where it wasn't really a revolution, it was almost like a restoration? In many ways, Alberta independence would be a restoration of true Canadian values away from Ottawa, the sort of imposters who have taken over Laurentian Canada.
Well, like actually, I've seen people say things. People will say, "Well, you guys aren't patriotic Canadians," and an independent supporter will say, "Yeah, we are. We just want to save the best part of it. Alberta is the best part of Canada, and we want to save this part of Canada," which is kind of along lines of what you're speaking about there.
I wish British Columbia hadn't been taken over because it's so beautiful. Anyway, I
Well,
know.
Northern BC is very sympathetic to Alberta. I've talked to people from up there who say that Northern BC, the rural and small town area, they identify a lot with Alberta. And actually, geographically, they're on our side of the mountains, the northern part of BC. And so they see, Vancouver, the Lower Mainland, which is more liberal, they see that as being on the other side of the mountains, whereas Alberta is near of kin to them on the prairies.
Yes, and yeah, there actually is a research paper from the Frontier Center for Public Policy examining how to change the borders to give Alberta access. And one of the ideas was to go through northern British Columbia and have that join Alberta. And as you say, probably those people would want to join. But so I agree. Initially, yes, literacy is pivotal to this issue, that the usual arguments against it are so shallow, it's pathetic. And Alberta really, it could be a shining example. And one of the important points made in the Sovereigntists Handbook by Corey Morgan was that, yes, Ottawa is an enemy of freedom, and Ottawa has centralized Canada, unfortunately. But you don't want to always be negative. The truth is that Alberta could be the most state-of-the-art nation on the planet. It really has the capacity to lead the world. Both the resources, the human capital, the traditions, I mean, many wonderful attributes. And I want to mention one other organization, the Holtain Research Institute, led by Marco Navarro-Gini, a friend of ours, who does wonderful work. And it's not explicitly for separatism or independence, but it looks at the, let's say, structural problems of Canada. Now, aside from greater literacy and, let's say, supporting independent media such as the Western Standard, which to me is crucial because when you've got government media funded from Ottawa, what do you expect them to parrot, right? They're going to spread the status quo. They're going to defend Ottawa. They're going to promote the Canadian pension plan or Canada pension plan. Now, what other, let's say, particular events or organizations would you like to see thrive so that we don't have this, let's say, populist wave with Alberta independence or towards Alberta independence and actually have more of a ratchet effect going clearly in that direction?
Yeah, well, like there has been an organization called the Alberta Prosperity Project for the last few years, and they're favorable towards that. So I'm hoping that they can build their organization and have that ready for when that time comes. There's also been some independence parties in Alberta, but they've both suffered from internal divisions and problems that way. So if there's a number of people who support independence, but they can't get along, and for one reason or another, and that's kind of hampered the success of the movement. Actually, that goes back, even in the early '80s, that was one of the things that affected the independence movement poorly was the division among the people involved, and so that's kind of an issue that we need to resolve among ourselves. But so there's at least one or two independence parties, presenting that. But I kind of favor the non-party organizations like the Alberta Prosperity Projects, because you can bring people together from various parties. And I just mentioned like Corey Morgan's in his book, he's talking about people working within a mainstream party, the UCP, which is it's kind of a different philosophy than the movement has generally. Like in the past, the movement has generally tried to come behind a particular independence party, and Corey was involved in that, and that's why he points out that hasn't been successful in his view, and so he thinks it's better to work within the UCP. But there is going to always be people who are interested in the party pathway to independence, and so those kind of organizations can be important and can play an important role if they could overcome some of the divisions and have a consistency, like you mentioned, like with each wave we'd get organizations would start and then they'd fade away with the when the wave went away. But we need the organizations that are going to continue in existence so that they can benefit from the experience of the past and build on the next wave that comes forward.
Yeah, and so much to say, and Michael, I really am pleased to interact with you and learn from you. People read his Western Standard columns. One little tidbit from your book. So this is called Time to Leave, Canada Cannot Be Fixed. Great, up-to-date grounder on this topic. You mentioned Ruth Gorman, and this touches upon this division in the 80s that oddly to many people, she was basically an outspoken feminist and defender of First Nation or Aboriginal rights. I'm not sure what the correct term is these days for the original Canadians. And she was a big Alberta independence supporter. And especially because I think she realized as a legal scholar that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was going to centralize the country and undermine, I guess, maybe the Indigenous or Aboriginal communities. So that is interesting. Now, just a short comment about the United Conservative Party or UCP in Alberta. It's called the United Conservative Party because there were fractures, right? There was the Wild Rose Party, and then there's been the various independence parties that have gone up and then come back down. Yeah. So I tend to agree with Corey because, in my opinion, now I don't know Danielle Smith well. I've met her a few times, but if there were sufficient support for a referendum, she would go along with it. There already is, let's say, the leadership in the UCP to accept Alberta independence if it is the desire of Albertans. That's my opinion, that she would go along with it. We already have someone elected who is sympathetic to the idea enough, but she's not going to just go and do it on her own. She really wants the institutional and activist support to make it happen. Am I wrong in my interpretation there?
I don't think so generally. And you might remember back in November, the UCP had its convention, and there was a Western Standard article about that convention where it said, one of the convention goers went up to a microphone and said he would like Alberta to become independent. And apparently there's a huge cheer from among all the convention attendees, like the thousands of people
Yes.
cheered his comment that Alberta, he would like Alberta. I think she is sympathetic, and she has the authority to call a referendum if she wants to. So that authority is already hers legally to call an independence referendum. But like you say, she would need enough support to be able to move forward with that. She couldn't go forward on that without having a lot of public support, or else it would undermine, her credibility. But there are certainly people within that party, probably even elected MLAs, who are sympathetic to the idea. So if something happens this year that really undermines Alberta within Canada, it's theoretically possible that they could move forward with an independence referendum.
I tend to take optimism from your point earlier that there just seems to be this little simmering and growth over time in the right direction. That as more people understand the issues, they realize this idea just makes sense, especially from, yes, an economic or financial standpoint, that you're being routed by this central government and Alberta just doesn't need it. Now, but as you say, calling a snap referendum right now would seem to be a suicide mission because you'd get maybe 25, 35%, and that's not enough, right? So you would probably do damage to the movement without doing the homework, the groundwork of building that support.
There are things happening, like right now, as you mentioned earlier, like there's discussion in Alberta because of President Trump being inaugurated, his threat to impose tariffs on Canadian products. And Danielle Smith has been trying to defend Alberta's interests in that. And the federal government has talked about putting an export tax on oil as one way of responding to Trump. And she has resisted that and said she would never accept that. And something like an export tax on oil now could create the kind of wave of support that we've talked about earlier, for independence. So those kind of things are kind of floating around, and depending on how the next few weeks turn out, and even with the election later this year for the federal election, these kind of things could play into building support for the independence movement this year.
Yeah, I just want to read one quote from you, right, which I think captures the issues. The failure of those initiatives, we're referring to all the efforts from Albertans to make change, clearly demonstrates that attempting to reform Canada is a dead end. Only the pursuit of independence can result in Alberta having control of its own future to achieve freedom and prosperity. I mean, to me, it's very simple logic, right? But you've got to overcome these barriers of, yes, institutional education or regime media, what have you. So that's the real issue now. If people want to follow Michael, yes, I say his latest book is Time to Leave. This No Other Option is also useful. Corey Morgan's book is great. You can read mine if you want to get a distilled version. I'm excited about this. I think it's a time that whose idea has come or is in the process of becoming popular enough. And as you say, this standoff right now, just yesterday, I think it was from Danielle Smith, between Alberta and the other provinces really has brought this issue to light. So there really is momentum in your direction. Folks, read Michael Wagner's work. It's an honor to learn from you. Thanks for chatting with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to talk to you.